Welcome back to another season of Eerie Excursions, the podcast that takes the road less travelled and a left turn into the shadows with me, Amy, a history nerd who loves a good ghost story. Now, I'm no expert, so along our eerie adventure, we'll meet local guides who know all about the spooky legends lurking in their back garden. And watch out, because we might just be down the road from where you are right now. For today's trip, we're in the country's capital, London.
And what many people don't realise as they walk around this great metropolis, that they're actually travelling through one of the most haunted capital cities on earth. There's hardly an office, monument, street, alley, or underground station that does not have some ghostly tale attached to it. London is quite literally a place where the dead walk the streets.
You ready to delve into the darkness? Now, London is a city that almost needs no introduction, being one of, if not the, most recognisable and well-known cities in the UK. Millions of tourists flock to the city every year to soak in its cultural, political, and historical significance. And it's the history we're most interested in today, obviously. Now, the city has seen plagues, fires, revolutions, and revolts over its almost 2,000-year history. It's even had one of the world's most famous serial killers stalk its streets. But we'll be staying clear of Old Jack in today's episode. Now, before we take the underground into the darkness, though, let's meet our guide.
Hello everyone, my name's Alan Aspinall and I'm going to be your guide today. I'm a fully trained City of London guide, trained by the Corporation of the City of London. I'm also a seasoned ghost hunter with over 20 overnight ghost hunts under my belt. And I'm also the author of the fictional horror series, The Fading Light, which is available on Amazon in ebook form. My ghost walk I've been doing for the last year or so. So I've been actually trained as a guide for the last over a decade. And I've taken many people around the city.
So I meet Alan outside St. Paul's Underground Station, which is the area our tour takes place in today. For those unfamiliar with London geography, St. Paul's sits to the east of the city's centre. It's surrounded by the financial district, but as Alan tells me, don't let the modern facade fool you into thinking you're only walking among the living.
Now, London. During the day, it plays host to over 1 million people coming into work, and also people visiting the various tourist locations and doing the shopping as well around the city. And what many people don't realise as they walk around this great metropolis, that they're actually travelling through one of the most haunted capital cities on earth. There's hardly an office, monument, street, alley, or underground station that does not have some ghostly tale attached to it. London is quite literally a place where the dead walk the streets. And as the sun sets and the shadows grow long and the living retreat to their beds, the city is given over to the dead. Now, why is London so haunted? Well, don't let the modern motor traffic and skyscrapers fool you. London is an incredibly ancient city with almost continuous 2,000 years worth of continuous habitation. Of course, it started life with a small Roman settlement of Londinium in 43 AD. And since then, we've seen the coming and going of many different people. The Romans' legions left, the Saxons colonised, the Vikings invaded, and the Normans conquered. And each one of these groups has left a mark upon the city. We also have to remember London has seen many untimely deaths. We had terrorist attacks in recent years. We had the Blitz, or the large-scale bombing that took place in London during World War II. And to a lesser extent, the Zeppelin raids of the First World War. We also had the Great Fire of London of 1666, which decimated the old medieval city. And of course, we've had natural disasters such as plagues, such as the Great Plague of 1665 and the Black Death of 1348. So death is no stranger to London. On this walk, we're going to encounter everything from murderous queens to demon dogs. They'll also encounter a few gentler souls along the way. And while this is primarily a ghost walk, we will be touching some of London's most historical locations. So you'll get a feel for the history as well as we go around this great metropolis. Well, I can't promise you we'll see any ghosts. They have a bit of a strict union, so they work when they want to. Hopefully, I will give you a feel for what you can actually encounter if you do your own ghost walks around the city. So without further ado, shall we head off to our first stop?
So from just outside St. Paul's Underground, we turn left and cross over the road to Greyfriars Church, which is an unusually beautiful destroyed church.
Okay, everyone, we're now standing here in the remains of Greyfriars Church. If you look around, it's a garden, rather lovely looking garden laid out by the Corporation of the City of London. And we're standing in what would have been the central aisle of the church. The church itself hasn't fared too well in recent years and was actually hit by an incendiary device in December 1940 during the Blitz, or large-scale bombing that took place in London during that time. And so it's a rather fitting place for us to start our walk, because it does look like a place you would assume to be haunted. Corporation of the City of London, as I said, turned it into a rose garden in the 1980s, and the actual garden actually follows the layout of the church. Where we're now standing is the central aisle of the church. The flower beds that were on either side of us would have been where the congregation would have sat. And even the wooden structures in the actual amongst the flowers are where the pillars that supported the roof would have actually been. And the tower itself, which rises high above our heads, is now a private residence worth several £1 million if you can actually afford it. Now, this site, the Greyfriars Monastery. This was the church that stood upon this site before Christopher Wren rebuilt it after the Great Fire of London of 1666. The Greyfriars, or the Franciscans, as they're properly called, came to London in the early 13th century. They were called the Greyfriars because of their grey habits. And they settled this land in 1225. And they were actually given this land by a wealthy textile merchant by the name of John Ewin. There was only 4 brothers to start with. But the Franciscans essentially practiced what they preached. They actually went out and they helped the sick, the needy. And because of that, the Franciscan order was very popular with Londoners. Because of that, they had a massive recruitment drive. And by the 1240s, those 4 brothers had morphed into 80 brothers. In fact, this old church, the original one that stood upon the site, went on to become the second largest church in medieval London. Only the old St. Paul's Cathedral beating it in terms of size. Now, this is a very haunted location. But the most famous ghost that's said to actually haunt here is a woman by the name of Queen Isabella. She was one of England's medieval queens. But as history has more ominously called her, the she-wolf of France. Now, Queen Isabella married King Edward II of England in 1308, when she was just 12 years old. Despite this being quite young at the time, she would eventually go on to become one of the great beauties of her age. She was also described as being a very intelligent woman as well. And she was much admired by many of the courtiers. That is except for one individual, her husband, King Edward II. See, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that King Edward II was actually homosexual and therefore more interested in his male colleagues than he ever was in his wife. One story says how King Edward II actually gave some of Queen Isabella's best wedding gifts to one of his male favourites, a man by the name of Piers Galveston. Needless, this didn't go down too well with his wife. Despite this, though, Queen Isabella actually served him faithfully for many years, even produced heirs for him. But after a decade or so of this mistreatment, she grew tired of his behaviour, and she eventually found a lover of her own in the form of an ex-old English nobleman by the name of Roger Mortimer. And with his help, she launched an invasion from her homeland of France, which dethroned King Edward II. And he was actually placed under house arrest in Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire. And in his place, Isabella and his son, King Edward III, was put on the throne in place of his father. Now, it was in 1327 that King Edward II died under somewhat mysterious circumstances. It's never been proven, but it was believed that Roger Mortimer and Queen Isabella actually arranged his death. The most common story says that while in prison in the castle, he was bent over, his breeches were pulled down, a funnel was placed into his backside, and then a red-hot poker was taken and rammed down into his bowels, thus bringing about an agonising death, but one that would leave no mark upon the body. Now, when Queen Isabella finally died in 1358, she was actually buried here at the Greyfriars Monastery. And she was actually buried in a Greyfriars habit. See, at the time, it was believed the Greyfriars, the Franciscans, because of all the good work they'd done, could essentially walk through the gates of heaven unchecked by St. Peter. So if you were someone who had led a less than stellar life, you were essentially paid to be buried in one of these habits as a way of essentially buying your way into heaven. Unfortunately, for Queen Isabella, this doesn't seem to have worked. You see, during the hours of dawn and dusk, when the city is quiet, her wraith is still said to haunt this garden. She appears in all the beauty of her youth, though she's described as being a very angry spirit, no doubt because of all the injustice she suffered during her lifetime. She's also said to be a very active spirit as well. City workers, especially during the winter months when it's dark around here in the morning, are said to avoid the garden for fear of running into her ghost. In fact, one story from about 10 years ago describes a postman riding past the church early one morning. He looked over towards the garden and see a woman dressed in rather strange garb walking amongst the flowers. He wasn't aware of the city's history and that, and so didn't think too much of it, but he did actually mention it to a colleague when he got into work. He was a little bit more knowledgeable about the history of the area, and he said he might actually seen Queen Isabella's shade doing one of her nightly rambles. Now, if you're thinking of looking for Queen Isabella's ghost, be warned. She may appear as a young, attractive woman, but she's also quite a macabre ghost to run into. You see, when she was buried here on the site, she wasn't just buried in the Greyfriars habit, she was also buried with a box upon her chest. And in this wooden box was the petrified heart of her husband. And this is what she's described as carrying through her nightly haunts. Where the heart is described as being fresh and continuing to pump blood like it's just been plucked from a living chest. Though it does bring a somewhat happier end to our story, you see the Queen has one thing in death that she never had in life. She had the heart of her husband forever.
Just as we're about to leave Greyfriars, though, Alan mentions Queen Isabella isn't the only noble lady haunting the site.
There's a woman by the name of Alice Hungerford. She murdered her first husband in around the time of Henry VIII and married his boss, essentially, Sir Edward Hungerford. When he died, he actually died of nothing was natural causes. I think he died of that. It actually protected her, but then with him dead, they actually tried her for murder for the first husband, and so she was executed. And she haunts the site as well. Again, another young woman.
Now we'll leave the two women to their peace and head right out of the church's ruins and across the street to the notorious Old Bailey.
Okay, we're now standing here outside the Central Criminal Court, which is more commonly referred to as the Old Bailey. The Old Bailey's been probably one of the most prominent courthouses in the country and has seen some of the most biggest court cases in British history, such as that of Peter Sutcliffe, who in the 1970s was more famously referred to as the Yorkshire Ripper and murdered a number of women in the north of England. And there have been other cases since then as well, usually of quite significant importance. There has been an Old Bailey courthouse in the City of London since 1539. The current one, like many of London's structures, isn't the original and was actually rebuilt in the 1907. It was actually designed by a man by the name of Eric Montford. Though additional was added on in the 1970s, increasing the size of the courthouse. It now has 19 courtrooms with around 70 cells for the various suspects. And the building is open to the public with court cases happening daily, which you can actually go and view. The most striking feature of the courthouse, of course, though, is the statue of Lady Justice, who stands over 60 metres above our heads. She holds the scales of justice in one hand and the swords of retribution in the other. She's different from other lady justices. This one isn't blindfolded. She can see everything, so behave yourselves. Now, the reason why I've stopped us here today, though, is because I want to tell you about another instrument of justice that stood upon this site from the 12th century right up to 1902. And this was the dreaded Newgate Prison. Now, Newgate Prison went through various incarnations during its long life. This is because during times of civil unrest, it was often targeted by the citizens of London, and it burned down on a number of occasions. It had to be rebuilt. Now, what was Newgate Prison like? Well, a famous magistrate and novelist from the 18th century described Newgate Prison as being the prototype of hell. The ventilation was non-existent. The water supply was completely inadequate, and it was said you could not walk down the corridors without your feet crunching in all the lice that infested the place. To make matters worse, the prison was frequently hit by a virulent form of typhoid known as gallows fever. And many of the prisoners who had been sentenced to death never made it to hangman's scaffolding because this terrible disease actually took them. Needless to say, this was a very haunted location. In fact, the most haunted part of the prison was an area known as Birdcage Walk, or as it was more ominously referred to as Dead Man's Walk. And it sat at the back of the prison. The reason why it was called Dead Man's Walk, though, is because prisoners being taken to the scaffolding would be carried off would walk down this passageway, and once they'd been hung, they're then brought back and buried in the lime pits underneath the passageway. So as I said, there's quite a few ghost stories here. The most famous, though, comes from the late 19th century and deals with one of Britain's most prolific serial killers. This was Amelia Dyer, was history more commonly refers to her as the baby farmer of Reading. Now, before we carry on, what was a baby farmer? Well, if you was a woman who had a child out of wedlock during this time, during the 19th century, there was no social service to look after you. Your family could disown you. You could lose your job if you was employed. You could literally face starvation because no one wanted anything to do with you. To make matters worse, you couldn't even take the child to an orphanage because they believed the child had been conceived in sin, and therefore it would be inherently sinful. Therefore, you had no other option. What could you do? This is where the baby farmers came in. The baby farmers were private citizens who, for a one-off fee of £5 to £10, which was considered some money back then, would take the child off your hand and attempt to rehouse it for you. Unfortunately, in Amelia Dyer's case, she was taking the money, she was murdering the children. And when I say children, we're talking toddlers here. She was actually using bits of cord to strangle them. Her crime came to light in 1896, when a bargeman in Reading, which is on the Thames like London, but about 30 miles to the west of the city, saw a brown package floating in the Thames. This bargeman was named Charles Humphreys. He hooked in the package, thinking he'd found something valuable he could actually take to a pawn shop. But upon opening the package, he was confronted with something terrifying. It was the body of a young female infant, no older than 6 months old. He quickly called the police, and they descended upon the area where they began to make searches of the river, where they found other brown packages with infants in various states of decomposition. There was some evidence on one of these packages, though, that actually led to an address. The police quickly descended upon this location, where they found Amelia Dyer, and she was arrested upon the spot. Her court case took place that year across the road at the Old Bailey Courthouse. It was a big sensation, as you can imagine. It took the jury less than 4 minutes to find her guilty. In fact, her own daughter actually turned evidence against her. Though there is some evidence to actually suggest that her daughter was actually involved in this case as well, but we don't know for sure. What makes it even truly more horrifying was that Amelia Dyer was probably doing this close to 25 to 30 years. So the sheer number of dead infants at her hands could be quite staggering. In fact, they actually called her the angel maker. Now, her ghost story involving Amelia, though, starts on the day of her execution. She was being led down Dead Man's Walk. As she was going down the passage towards her death, she actually stopped, looked towards a young guy by the name of Scott, and smiled at him. She said, "I'll see you again someday, sir." Now, Scott didn't think much of this. After all, she was going to be hanging soon, and so he just discounted it. She was crazy. And indeed, within 20 minutes, she was hanging from the hangman's scaffolding. Little did Scott realise, though, Amelia was to keep her promise. It was now 1902. It was the closure of Newgate Prison. Scott was working in an office off a Dead Man's Walk. It was the early hours of the morning. The bell of St. Sepulchre, which is across the road from us, the church, told the hour of 2 o'clock, the witching hour, the time when the vow between the living and the dead is said to be it's finished. As he sat there, though, he had a feeling that he was being watched. Now, he ignored this, carried on working. He wasn't a man of frail nerves, but the feeling got worse. And then he heard a voice echoing from beyond the grave. "See you again, sir, see you again." Scott turned round and looked towards the door that led out to Dead Man's Walk. In the grate in the doorway was a face pushed up against it. And in that face was Amelia Dyer. Scott jumped up and, showing more courage than I would have done, flew across the office, threw open the door, ready to confront this horrendous apparition. But when the door opened, Dead Man's Walk was empty. There was no sign of Amelia Dyer. Now, had he dreamt this? Had he fallen asleep? Possibly. But as he stood there, he noticed something. There was a single woman's handkerchief slowly drifting towards the ground. Upon that handkerchief was the initials EA, Amelia Dyer. The child murderer kept her promise. It seems the devil does look after his own.
Now we're not quite ready to leave Newgate Prison as we head behind the Old Bailey for even more chilling tales.
Okay, we're now standing here at the entrance to Armand Court, which is a private residence, so we can't actually go into it now. These buildings here, these red brick buildings, though, actually date from after the Great Fire of London of 1666, and I think we're looking at 17th, 18th century. A good indication of just how old they are is the metal railings around the doors. If you actually look, you can see like these funnel-like structures coming out of them. These funnel structures would have been essentially like candle snuffers, and that's what they essentially were, oversized candle snuffers. Keep in mind, during the 17th, 18th century, before the advent of electricity and even gas lighting, a lot of European cities after dark were essentially pitch black. And so if you were someone going to an event or maybe like a theatre or travelling at night, you'd pay essentially young boys known as link boys who would carry flaming pitchers in front of you to get you to your destination home again. And these boys would actually use these candle snuffers to actually put out their flames once the job was actually done. Now, these houses here are important. They have very significant religious connotations because this is where the priests and clergy of St. Paul's actually live. In fact, the whole area has religious sounding names. We have Armand Court, Armand Lodge, Armand Corner, Ave Maria Lane, and we have even Paternoster Square, Pattern, of course, Paternoster being Latin for our Father. Part of the reason being is because we're very close to St. Paul's Cathedral, and the priests and clergy of medieval St. Paul's Cathedral would essentially go around this area chanting their paternosters. So we still have that connection to this day. But what I'll sort of draw your attention to is that wall at the far end of the corridor. It's obscured a little bit by trees and bushes and that. But some say this is the last remaining part of Newgate Prison still above ground. And on the other side of that wall would have been Dead Man's Walk, the area we was talking about at our last stop. This structure is still, this wall is said to be a very haunted location, and it has two ghosts attached to it. The first one is one of the more gentler souls tonight. It's a man by the name of Jack Sheppard. And Jack Sheppard lived during the early 18th century. And originally he was a carpenter by trade. He was trained to be a carpenter, an apprentice carpenter. But towards the end of his training, he basically fell in love with a prostitute. And because of this, he then abandoned his training and eventually became a cat burglar. And he was a very famous individual at the time. But not because of his ability to steal anything, but from his ability to actually escape from prisons. He was almost like the 18th century equivalent of the famous escape artist Harry Houdini. He actually escaped from Newgate Prison no less than 2 times. His most famous escape was his last one, which was on the eve of his execution. Keep in mind, justice was a lot more harsher back then, and even though there's no evidence that Jack was a violent individual, he was a bit of a lovable rogue, he'd been sentenced to death. Because of his ability to escape prison, the authorities were taking no chances. He was in solitary confinement. He was shackled to the floor, shackled to the walls, handcuffed and manacled at the legs. This didn't stop Jack. He'd managed to smuggle it in a small bit of metal, bit of iron, which he used to pick at the mortar, holding the chains to the floor and the wall. Once they were free, he then used it to pick the handcuffs, which he then discarded. He couldn't get rid of the leg irons just yet, but he was still able to move around. He then looked around his cell. He saw the chimney in the cell. So what did he do? He began to shimmy up the chimney. Halfway up, he found a metal bar blocking his access. He took that same bit of metal that he had earlier, picked away at the mortar, freeing the bar. He then got into the cell above his one, found the room locked. He then took that metal bar and managed to break through it. He found 4 other closed doors, which he then managed to break through one after the other, before finally getting out onto the roof of Newgate Prison. He looked around, looked down, and he realised it was far too high for him to jump. At best, he would hurt himself seriously. At worst, he was going to break his neck. So what did he do? He went all the way back down to his cell, got his bed sheets, went all the way back up to the roof, where he improvised a rope, which he used to abseil down the side of the building, finally finding one of the windows on the buildings that were standing next to it open, which he promptly got through, and he made his way down to the ground level, where he entered out onto the street and off into the night. Now, sadly, Jack's ability to escape prison didn't match his ability to evade capture. And he was discovered about 2 weeks later, drunk as a skunk, in a pub nearby here, where he was promptly handed back over to prison authorities. It was in 1724 that he actually was executed. The day of his execution, a lot of people turned up to watch this take place, but not because they actually wanted to see him hang. Like I said, he was a bit of a lovable rogue. Seems a bit like Robin Hood, though there was no evidence that it suggested he ever gave to the poor. They turned up because they actually wanted to see him make another dramatic escape. Unfortunately, because so many people turned up, any plans Jack actually had went out the window because he couldn't actually get anywhere. But he did actually go out with a smile on his face. He'd become such a celebrity now, and he was reveling in his fame. And so, ever the showman, it seems, Jack's ghost follows the same pattern now all the time. Late at night, people walking into the courtyard are startled by a man in strange costumes coming out one of the doorways. This figure looks around to see if he's been spotted. Once he's sure the coast is clear, he then bolts towards the onlooker. But just before he reaches them, he begins to fade in the thin air, leaving the person somewhat startled, and no doubt a little bit terrified by what they just encountered. But it's Jack for you. Got a bit of a warped sense of humour. The second thing that's said to haunt here is said to be one of the oldest hauntings in the city of London. And I say thing for a reason. Because this thing might not be a ghost, it might actually be demonic. This is the dreaded Black Dog of Newgate. Now, the Black Dog of Newgate is said to have its origins in a famine that struck London in the 13th century around the time of Henry III. The famine was so severe that citizens of London were starving. Of course, the residents of Newgate Prison didn't even eat at the best of times. It's said to start with, they turned on the rats, the inmates did. But they quickly exhausted those. So what did they turn on next? Each other. They resorted to cannibalism. The guards themselves were only too happy to turn a blind eye to this. After all, it meant the prisoners were hungry, were being fed. They didn't have to deal with it. Less mouths to feed. One such individual sent to the prison was a man by the name of Striker, a rather portly fellow. He'd been sent there for the crime of sorcery. He lasted less than 1 day before the older, more established prisoners who'd formed gangs killed him and stewed his flesh. Even went on to describe it as being like tender eating. Unfortunately for those inmates, it seems like there may have been some truth to this guy being a sorcerer. You see, the day after his death, as the sun began to set, terrible black howls were heard coming from deep within the bowels of Newgate Prison. As the sun slowly set below the horizon, a terrible black hound emerged from the basement. It was described as being the size of a small pony. It had eyes the size of saucers and teeth the size of daggers. It began to hunt down each of the prisoners who had taken the sorcerer's flesh, ripping each one of them limb from limb. It was only as the sun began to rise that this beast disappeared back into the bowels of Newgate. The guards made a search for it, but could find no trace of it. It was gone. Some of the prisoners that had taken part in the murder actually survived that first massacre, and they thought they got away with it. But as the sun began to set again on that next day, the same thing began to happen. Terrible howls were heard coming from within the bowels of the prison. They realised now that the beast had returned for them. In a panic, they killed their guards and escaped the prison, running far and wide. There's a line in Dracula that I like. It says the dead travel fast. And this beast tracked each one of them down, ripping them limb from limb. It was only when the last of these prisoners died, the beast returned to Newgate Prison, where it became something of a grim death omen. It was said to appear on the night before an execution or the night before a prisoner drew his last breath. It was hoped in 1902, when the prison was finally demolished, that this thing would go with it. It has not. And it's still commonly seen on the wall late at night, a shapeless black mass, it's said to creep along at the top of the surface. As it reaches the end of the wall, it begins to slide off, where it slowly begins to dissolve into nothingness. Before it vanishes, the smell of death is said to fill the air, and the sound of people moving around in shackled feet can be heard, a grim reminder of that terrible place that once existed upon the other side of that wall.
As always, you can visit the places we've heard about today, and in fact, you can book on a tour with Alan. To hear his full tour, the links are provided below in the show notes. And if you do find yourself behind the Old Bailey, near the last remaining part of Newgate Prison, watch out for the shadows. You never know what's lurking there. It could be Jack, or it could be something a little more frightening. That's it for now. You can also follow us on Instagram at Eerie Excursions. And to be sure you don't miss out on an excursion, subscribe to the YouTube channel below. For our next adventure, we'll be heading up north to the city of Chester.
Somebody has said to the vicar of St. John's that this is a thin place. This was a pagan Christian, and he was told that this Chester was a thin place where it's easy for people from the other world to come through.
See you next time for another venture into the darkness.